Well, it's worth tarrying for a moment to consider just how sharp and dramatic is the clash of values between, on the one hand, the humanistic conception that runs from the Enlightenment right through to 20th century figures like Russell and Dewey, and on the other hand, the prevailing doctrines of today, which are indeed the doctrines that Adam Smith bitterly denounced as the vile maxim of the masters. And were also denounced in pretty much the same terms by the independent popular press, working class mostly press, lively and vibrant working class press of the 19th century, which condemned what it called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth forgetting all but self. That's Smith's vile maxim. It's remarkable to trace the evolution of values from a pre-capitalist thinker like Adam Smith, with his stress on sympathy, on the goal of perfect equality, on the basic human right to creative work, and then on to the present, to those who laud the new spirit of the age, sometimes invoking Smith's name. For example, Nobel Prize-winning economist James Buchanan, who writes in a recent book that what each person seeks is in an ideal situation is mastery over a world of slaves. And it's only if we accept that fundamental principle that we can sort of spin out the rest of economic theory. That's you, in case you didn't notice it. That's something that Adam Smith would have regarded as completely pathological. I think there's no doubt about that. The new spirit of the age had to be imposed by force. It wasn't easy to impose. In fact, there's been about a century and a half of struggle to drive it down people's throats, and it hasn't quite made it yet. That fact ought to be familiar from our own history. Unfortunately, it isn't, but it's a major theme of American history, as it was a major theme of the history of England before us. Modern America was created over the protests of its working people, as the distinguished Yale historian, labor historian David Montgomery points out in a recent book quite correctly. And those protests were vigorous and outspoken, in particular in the popular press, which flourished from the early, about around 1840, that part of the 19th century, right up to the 1950s. Finally, there's a source that one can look at. It's been very hard to get access to this. The major book on it was published in 1924 by Norman Ware, who's the first modern labor historian, but it's been out of print forever. It just was reprinted, and it's, I think, very worth reading. Very illuminating. It's mostly quotes from the 19th century working class press. And remember, that was very substantial in scale. It was completely independent. It was just written by working people. Much of it edited and run by women, in fact, what were called the factory girls in Lowell, Massachusetts, and so on, and all over the place, from the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution up until it finally was killed off. I think one learns quite a lot from reading it about this spontaneous, essentially untutored, spontaneous reactions to the growing tide of capitalist authoritarianism, which was dominant across the working class, ordinary working people, until finally it was either beaten out of their heads or just silenced by bigger concentrations of power. The book's now again in print, and I think you can learn a lot about it from it, about human nature, in fact, how it reflects itself when the new spirit of the age was imposed on it, on people. The review, just to give you the themes that run through it, I'll just quote some standard phrases that run through this whole period, are protest against what people call degradation, loss of dignity and independence, loss of self-respect, the decline of the worker as a person, the sharp decline in cultural level and attainments, which is a very striking fact, as workers were subjected to what they called wage slavery, not much different, they claimed, than the chattel slavery that they had fought to overcome during the Civil War. In their own words again, the working class press wrote that when you sell your product, you retain your person, but when you sell your labor, you sell yourself. You lose your rights as a free man, and you become the vassal of mammoth establishments, of a moneyed aristocracy that threatens annihilation to anyone who questions their right to enslave and oppress. Those who work in the mills ought to own them, the factory workers said back in the early 19th century. They should not have the status of machines ruled by private despots who are entrenching monarchic principles on democratic soil. This is not so long after the democratic revolution of the 18th century, and the idea that monarchic principles should be reestablished on democratic soil was intolerable as these private despots drive downward freedom and rights, civilization, health, morals, and intellectuality in their new commercial feudalism. The labor press also condemns what they call the bought priesthood of the media, universities, and the intellectual class, the apologists who sought to justify what this absolute despotism that was the new spirit of the age and to instill its sordid and demeaning values. One of the early leaders of the AFL, about a century ago, that's, remember, the more conservative part of the labor movement, one of the early leaders of the AFL in around 1890 expressed the common view when he described the mission of the emerging labor movement, fighting bitter hostility and huge violence. I mean, it was way beyond anything in Europe. He described its mission as to overcome the sins of the market and defend democracy by extending it to control over industry by working people. And it, again, was not until the 1950s that the democratic culture succumbed to a huge corporate offensive, barely known, but there was an enormous propaganda offensive, business-based propaganda offensive in the early and through the 1950s, actually reached the point just to drive out of people's heads the idea that you could have the democratic culture of the kind I've just described. All of these ideas, kind of just sampled, which just come out of ordinary working people putting together their own thoughts, expressing them, and so on, without any tutelage or anything else. And they're very similar all the way through. And these, I think, would have been completely intelligible to founders of classical liberalism, people like Adam Smith, or his contemporary, Wilhelm von Humboldt in Germany, who inspired John Stuart Mill, and who, like Smith, regarded creative work freely undertaken in association with others as the core value of a human life. As von Humboldt, these are the classics of classical liberalism. As he put it, if a person produces an object on command, we may admire what he did, but we will despise what he is. And for similar reasons, Adam Smith warned that in any civilized society, the government would have to intervene to prevent the division of labor, which he opposed, contrary to what's believed, and the government would have to do that in a civilized society in order to prevent division of labor from turning people into, as he put it, creatures as stupid and ignorant as it's possible for a human being to be. That is the obvious result of division of labor, which will turn someone into, just a machine. Maybe we'll admire what he does, but we'll despise what he is in the classical liberal terms. Smith, for similar reasons, based his rather nuanced advocacy of markets. He did advocate markets, but in a pretty complex way and a nuanced way, and he based it on the principle that under conditions of perfect liberty, markets would lead to perfect equality, and that was the moral justification for them. The idea that you either have equality or markets, that's a modern idea, strenuously opposed by Smith, and if he had believed that was true, he would have opposed markets based on his own principles. These are major ideas of the classics which have not only been forgotten, but indeed grossly distorted in contemporary culture as it reconstructs them. You can find it out. The texts are available. Here the same thoughts were commonly expressed. So de Tocqueville, in his famous Democracy in America, another standard thing that you're supposed to name but not read, he was particularly struck by what he called the equality of condition in America and regarded that as a prerequisite for democracy, as distinct from Europe, where there were sharp distinctions in condition and status and wealth, and therefore democracy was impossible. Here he echoed von Humboldt and Adam Smith, and in fact the labor press at the same time, in describing wage labor and division of labor as degrading, dehumanizing to the laborer. De Tocqueville's phrase was that art advances, but the artisan recedes. That's the same point that Smith and von Humboldt and other classical liberals are making when they oppose wage labor. Thomas Jefferson, the leading Enlightenment figure in the United States, along with Benjamin Franklin, who took exactly the same view, Jefferson argued that, as he put it, dependence will lead to subservience and venality and will suffocate the genius of virtue. And remember, by dependence, he meant wage labor. That was the meaning of dependence. So when he talked about dependence leading to venality and subservience and suffocating the germs of virtue, germs, not genius, the germs of virtue, he was talking about wage labor, which was considered an abomination under classical liberal principles.